Good morning, everybody. My name's Leslie Nelson Addy from Running Me Trust, as I've been introduced already, and I just wanted to start off by introducing Bernardine Evaristo, who is an award-winning author of 10 books and numerous writings that span the genres of fiction, verse fiction, short fiction, non-fiction, poetry, essays, literary criticism, journalism, and radio and theatre drama. Her novel Girl, Woman, Other won the Booker Prize 2019 award, making her the first Black woman and Black British person to win it in its 50-year history. Girl, Woman, Other was added to the A-level curriculum in 2022, and that will be the kind of basis of our discussion today. So good morning, Bernardine Evaristo. So lovely to meet you.
Good to be here, Leslie, and good to be talking to all the people who are attending the conference.
Yes, absolutely. So just firstly, I'd like to thank you for writing such an incredible novel. There are characters in there that are for everyone, but also there were so many hilarious moments. I read it again in preparation for this and I just could not stop laughing. And I wanted to kind of first of all ask you about what inspired such humorous storytelling styles that you use for quite challenging topics, and what tips would you give to teachers who might want to teach students about writing humorous creative pieces?
Okay, interesting question. The humor comes naturally to me now. It's been there in practically all my books since my first book. My first book I think it had zero humor in it. And that was because it was a poetry collection based on poems that I'd written in my 20s, when I didn't think I'd really developed my sense of humor as a writer. And then a turning point for me was actually French and Saunders. People of a certain generation will remember French and Saunders most definitely. And British comedy still is very male, but it was extremely male in my childhood. And these were two women who were of my generation writing about women's issues. And they were really funny. And I remember they did a skit which was about schoolgirls. And I just remember thinking, oh, I want to write like that. I want to write with humor. And so I started to develop my ability to write humor. And it's got to the stage where, Go Woman Other was my 8th book, where it just happens naturally. And if it's not there in the writing, I think there's something wrong with the writing. It's like the thing that really satisfies me as a writer is to feel that there is some humor there, because that stops it being po-faced and it makes it more complex and rounded. Because with all due respect, if a book is humorless, and some books are, and they can also be great books, I have to say, but I think it's harder to win the reader around. And I deal with, as you say, very serious subjects and topics and stuff, but there's always humor somewhere in it. And I feel that makes the book more, the reader more accepting of what I'm exploring. And there's also a balance of the seriousness and the humor, the tragedy and the comedy. They kind of sit side by side in my work. But in terms of encouraging students to write humor, that's a really difficult one.
Yes.
I've asked that question before. They will know that some kids, young people, will have a very natural sense of humor. And some of them will be able to sort of transfer that to what they write. Yeah. I would say that the most important thing is to give the pupils freedom, because if the way in which creative writing is taught in schools is prescriptive, and the students feel that they have to abide by certain rules and have a certain kind of sensibility and aesthetic with what they're writing, then I think the humor is going to die. Is not going to come out. And we all actually have our own sense of humor, but some people have developed it more than others. So I think it's giving the students freedom to write humor. And then the other thing, in a way, it's kind of like the most obvious thing, is to give them examples of humorous writing. Show them where writers have been funny in different ways. So like there is humor in my books, right? You can show an extract from that. There'll be humor in other books, which will be exploring humor in a different way. And so that then gives them a sense of what they might aim for. And I guess the final part of the answer is, it doesn't have to be funny. They don't have to be funny to be developing their writing skills.
Right.
It's a part of my practice. It doesn't have to be part of theirs. And they shouldn't feel the pressure to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just another kind of question focused on this point around the comedy and the tragedy. How would you define the genre of Girl, Woman, Other? I think there's often a moment where people apply genres to a text, but the author may not necessarily agree with that genre that's been given to that text. So I wanted to find out what your perspective is on the genre of Girl, Woman, Other.
Well, in terms of literary genre, it's definitely literary fiction. I am 100% a literary writer in the sense that I am interested in language and how we use language. And I'm also interested in storytelling as well. But you don't have to be somebody with a particular sensitivity to language to tell great stories. And the books that actually do commercially, who perform best commercially in this country are what we might call commercial fiction. And those are books where often they're not particularly literary, but the writers can tell a very good story. I think an amazing book is, for example, one that a lot of people know is Misery by Stephen King. He does not finesse his sentences in a way that a literary writer might, but he can tell such an amazing story and has done for a very long time. So it's literary fiction, but within that, I call it fusion fiction. And that's something I made up. And because as I was writing it, I was thinking, this is really kind of like, it's not a traditional novel. It's breaking the rules, unconventional. It's kind of poetic, but it's not poetry. And in terms of my oeuvre, I have written verse novels. I have written prose novels, although my language is always poetic, regardless of whether it's supposed to be a prose novel or not. And with this, I knew it was really experimental because it was like these looping stories, interconnected, the whole life of a character in 30 pages, and then other characters appearing in their stories and then moving on to the next and moving on to the next. And I thought, I've got to come up with an identity for this. And I thought, fusion fiction. So that's what I call it. I haven't heard of that used in this way for any other kind of fiction. So yeah. And it's also actually commercial because it became a commercial success.
Yes.
So even though we have these categories, the boundaries are always blurred.
Yeah. And can kind of evolve over time, as you've highlighted.
Yes.
Amazing. So the novel is a collection, as you said, of individual stories told in arguably a really short space of within the text about women from the African diaspora who are all connected in some way. I found that fascinating. In a few of these narratives, you explore the effort some of the characters make to maintain connection to their roots and their traditions. How does London as a city and a character in your novel help to hinder this effort?
Oh, I have to say, you've got great questions.
Thanks.
Great questions are ones where I have to think
Yeah.
because I have literally done hundreds of interviews, and usually they ask a question, I open my mouth, and I'm literally not thinking. I'm just saying what I've said before. And you're making me think, which is great, right?
It's good.
London is my muse in many ways. It features strongly in most of my work, but I'm always trying to also take my characters out of London. So, if anybody's familiar with the whole of my work, they'll know that London is a recurrent kind of theme, but it's also, I try to be much more global because I don't want to be limited to London. And it's that the history of London is so deep. The demography of London is so interesting. It's so varied and is ever changing. The London of my childhood, very long time ago, is not the London we're living in today in many ways. The town I grew up in, Woolwich, was a white working class garrison town. It's less of a garrison town now. Now it is the next big kind of gentrified area, because the whole of the area around the Woolwich Arsenal, which was the old armaments factory, has been developed. You know, there's a creative culture. It's changing, it's changing, it's changing. And I think that is really fertile for my imagination. At the same time, as a writer who's interested in writing about the African diaspora, I was very aware when I was writing Girl, Woman, Other, and I have been at other times, that it can't just be about London, the capital city, nor can it just be about other major UK cities, which is why I was pushing some of the characters into other parts of the country, like the north of England, and into rural society, because I feel that having, you know, I'm very familiar with Black British literature. And I know for obvious reasons that a lot of the writers are London-based and do write about London for all the reasons I've mentioned, because it is, you know, it is where we settle, but it's also just such an interesting, fertile, ever-changing space. But at the same time, we need to claim ownership of these shores. And so it's really important that, for me, with Girl, Woman, Other, that I get the characters out of the city. And I still think it's quite London focused, but get them out of the city so that we can imagine a presence beyond the city. So I think the London issue is really interesting, because we don't want to be limited to it, because the UK is a huge country. And, you know, in America, a lot of African American writers did not grow up in, for example, New York. And so if you think about somebody like the great Toni Morrison, you know, she grew up in Ohio. And I think all her novels were set in Ohio. And Alice Walker grew up, I think, in Georgia. So, and those are just two of the biggest names. So the spread is vast in America. But in the UK, we're still kind of in London, mainly. And even more specific, you know, at the moment, South London.
Yeah.
Peckham, actually. Peckham is where a lot of writers are coming through, and they're writing about Peckham, which is wonderful. But we need to diversify in that way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in terms of diversifying, you also don't just kind of focus on space, but also some historical narratives too. So Amma's play is based on the kingdom of Dahomey. I hope I've pronounced that right. Details about this context are detailed in the first and final chapters of Girl, Woman, Other. When did you discover this history, and why did you choose to bookend the novel with this historical event?
Because essentially I'm a badass, right?
Yeah.
So the Amazons are African, you know, from Dahomey. I say Dahomey, it's not right.
Okay.
I don't know how to
Okay,
pronounce
cool.
So they were these African warrior women from, you know, a couple of hundred years ago. And I first heard about them probably about 40 years ago. And I was very interested in Black history. I was looking at African history at that time, not Black British history, because I wasn't really in tune with that. And there wasn't so much information about that, but definitely African history. And I was researching, and I was discovering all these African queens. And to be honest, that was so mind-blowing back then, because the sort of general knowledge about Africa and African history was so limited. It's still limited today, but it was even more limited 40 years ago. There wasn't you didn't have access to a lot of information. It was long before the internet. And so I discovered these Amazon warriors, and I had this poster, which I may have somewhere. And it was a poster of Dahomean warrior women. And it was a photograph taken, I can't remember when it was taken, I guess by the time photography had been invented, maybe the late 1800s. And I had that on my wall, definitely just throughout the whole of my 20s. I had it framed. It was just incredible. So that was when I first heard about them. And they became kind of like almost like spirit guides, because these women were warrior women who worked for the King of Dahomey, but they were fighters. And of course, anybody who's seen The Woman King will know Viola Davis and so many other incredible Black women actresses in that film at the moment. It is about the Amazon warriors, although she calls them by their original name, and I can't remember what that is. And so when I was writing this book, and Amma I was writing the character of Amma. She wasn't the first character I started with, by the way. It was Carol, but I put Amma in the beginning. I kind of switched it around. And it just made sense that this book was going to be about Black women, who were fighters in all kinds of ways. And why not have her play being about Amazon women warriors? And then it made sense to finish it with it as well. So it kind of happened naturally. But the seeds of that began over 40 years ago.
40 years ago. Wow. That's amazing. That's so powerful. I was just thinking about this in terms of them being like, as you described them as like spirits or like influencing you through your own writing journey, which I just find really, really powerful. And it's haunting but also inspirational at the same time. A few characters resolve their experiences of social isolation with assimilation. So you mentioned Carol, for example, who could be read in that way, but she kind of resolved some of the issues she experienced by becoming like more British, becoming more accepted within predominantly white spaces. What were you trying to communicate about the Western society and the social or even professional choices available to women of color?
Yeah, another great question. A star.
Thanks, thanks.
People don't realize when I'm being interviewed, I'm actually interviewing them in a way. But, the book is about plurality as much as I could get into a single novel. So there are 12 main characters, 11 of them are women, one is non-binary, and I just wanted to explore different areas in a way that there could be some connection between them. And Carol is a character that a lot of people really notice and often relate to. It's really, really interesting. I would say the one character people talk about more than any other is Carol. And I think that is because of what you're talking about what it's like to grow up in a society where you are seen as being at the bottom of the heap, and you're subject to all kinds of discrimination, race and gender and class, and also where you live, which is kind of tied in with class, but doesn't always have to be.
Yeah.
And then you find yourself moving with the elite in that society, the people who actually control that society. And that was a hell of a journey that Carol had to go on. And we are minoritized as people of color in this society. So that's one of the realities that we have to deal with. But with that, along with that, it is also a majority white society. So we have to make decisions about how we navigate that, how we negotiate climbing our way through this society to achieve the things that we want to achieve. And for Carol, she chose to assimilate in the way that she lost herself, or she lost who she had been. She lost her culture. She rejected her culture. She kind of was on the verge of rejecting her mother. Yeah. She had to completely change how she looked, how she spoke, how she thought, how she behaved when she was at Oxford. And that doesn't just happen to people of colour.
No.
Who come from working class backgrounds. That happens to lots of people who go to Oxford and Cambridge. Within a week, they're talking differently. But in her case, that was the way in which she could get on. The only way she could be there, because otherwise she was going to feel like she felt she was going to feel isolated for the rest of her time there. And then that continues through her life, and it works for her. It actually works for her. So I was showing that this is actually a success for her, and she's not somebody who code switch is. And that was also an option open to her, except perhaps not, because there was nobody around to show Carol that she could code switch. Yeah. Because we have to get that from somewhere. And so for her, there were two choices. Either she leaves the university and disappoints herself, disappoints her mother and the rest of it, but still stays the same as the person she is growing up, or she becomes a success in this society. And
Yeah.
that was the choice she made.
Mm. I think I understand why a number of people speak to you about Carol, because I feel like there's a lot of personal resonance as well. In some way, shape, or form, we're confronted with the choice to either assimilate or, like you say, code switch, or actually completely refuse to engage in that way, and the consequences are there. But it's powerful that you speak about assimilation being a route in her story as being one of success, because I think oftentimes when assimilation is spoken about, it's given such negative connotations, in a sense of almost denying yourself in order to survive, and it shouldn't be that way. But perhaps the time, the space will all determine whether it is actually a success or not.
But it's also that, you know, we do change as individuals.
Mm,
You know, it's going to happen anyway, whether we're assimilating or not. You know,
yeah.
most people are going to change through the course of
Change.
their lives. You
Mm,
know, so you may grow up listening to reggae, but you may have an affinity for classical Western music. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're assimilating. It's just that your
right.
tastes have changed, you know?
Yeah.
It is very complicated, but it
Yeah.
was really important for me to explore that what it takes to be a successful professional.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you expose inequalities in the education system and in the theatre industry. You also seem to present like a generational disparity between the older and younger characters' attitudes and efforts to social reform and political resistance. So, do any of these ideas link to your own experiences over the years? Like, it'd be nice to get to know a bit more about you, in this
Yeah.
regard.
That's a really nice way of phrasing it, because people still today say to me, are all the characters versions of you?
Mm.
Yeah, it's crazy. I was abroad quite recently, like 3 months ago. I'm just
Mm.
like, I'm still hearing this 4 years later. You know,
Yeah.
it's crazy. But I think I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I was definitely, you know, I think everybody knows now, I was very feminist, political activist, um, very black feminist, pro-black, and wanting to change society, which my first vehicle was theatre of black women. And of course, Amma is also somebody who's growing up in the same period I grew up in. And Amma isn't me, but out of all the characters, there's a little bit of me in Amma, you
Yeah.
know, and my earlier life was a bit like hers. And that was really important to write the narrative of feisty young women of color who felt rejected by white mainstream society in the 70s and 80s, and were determined to create art for themselves and to be at
Mm.
the helm of their creativity, to self-define and to find their community and to speak from and to their community. And that is Amma. But at the same time, because I've been around a long time, and I mix with all kinds of people, and I have lots of young people in my life. Some of them are friends. I'm very aware of the changes that have happened, and I think it's really important that as we age, we stay in touch with what young people are doing,
Yeah.
instead of adopting this slightly superior approach, or this slightly superior attitude of thinking that the young are wrong because their attitudes are different. So the relationship between Yaz and Amma, which is quite different, was something that was really interesting to explore, as well as Morgan as well. You know, the current wave of women who are feminists, or they may not identify as feminists, they may actually no longer identify as female, and the differences between those generations, and just kind of exploring it and airing it,
Mm.
and kind of presenting different arguments, which I do at the end of the book, between Dominique and Amma, and kind of Morgan's always there in the background, and Yaz, and yeah. So that's all part of it. I don't think really that I could have written the age range that I wrote if I was somebody who only mixed with my own age group. This
Right.
is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, that as you get older, you have your friendship group. And a lot of people don't leave that friendship group. And as a writer, how do you stay in touch with young people today if you're not communicating with them on an equal level? And that was really important. That is really important for me to continue to do. And
Yeah.
also, young people aren't moaning about their aches and pains and memory loss. Seriously, it's quite it's quite fun being around young people.
Yeah, and it's great that you mentioned young people because kind of going off of that, like your presentation of Yaz, who for me, I know that there are a number of young characters in the book, but I feel like she really exemplifies the younger generation for me anyway. And I just wanted to kind of find out about what your hopes were in terms of the younger generations, what they would receive from this text, considering how you positioned Yaz in this text. Yeah. So, what were your hopes that students would
Yeah, so
learn?
Yaz is 19 at the start of the book, so she is the youngest. And I love the fact that young women come to my readings, and men too, but primarily my audience is female, and they tend to dominate at literary festivals anyway. And I know that a lot of guys don't read books by women. That's statistically true.
Yeah.
But I love the fact that I have young women in my audience,
Mm.
and also I get feedback from young women about Yaz and saying what you said about, how they find her relatable in some ways, and also about just opening their mind to the scale of Black British womanhood, because there is Hattie at the age of 33 who's a
Yeah.
farmer, and you've got Shirley who's a school teacher, and what I want to do is to get inside all these characters,
Mm.
and I think through doing that I am dissolving some of the barriers that we have to understanding different age groups, different demographics, different points of view. And if I had Girl, Woman, Other available to me when I was like 19,
Yeah.
I would have, I mean, this is not, I'm not saying this egotistically at all, but I would have been mind blown
Mm.
because it would have been British. The
Yeah.
only books that were available, pretty much nearly the only books that were available for Black British people in the late 70s were African American books.
American.
And
Yeah.
by the 80s, it was African American women writers like Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, who I
Yeah.
loved, but they weren't writing about Britain.
Hmm.
And also, they didn't necessarily have that scale of representation of different kinds of womanhood,
Yeah.
including a non-binary figure. So it would have really opened my eyes, not only to perhaps holding up a mirror to myself in some ways, but also to the women around me and also the women who weren't around me.
Mm.
So I hope they find it. I hope young people find this book as enlightening as maybe anybody else does, even
Yeah.
though I'm not there to educate. As a writer, I'm there
No.
to tell stories. I'm not there to educate. But people
Yeah.
do feedback to me that it opened their eyes. And I
Yeah.
hope young women find that to be a kind of a consequence of reading it, and also that they do see themselves in some ways in it.
Yeah. Represented in those characters. And you speak about friendship. You spoke about friendship earlier, which I thought was really, really powerful in terms of thinking about cross-generational friendships. But I wanted to speak a little bit more about the complexity of motherhood and what is the importance, it's with specific consideration of some of the relationships that you present in the novel, of mothers in this Black community. Like, what is the importance of mothers there? Yeah.
The mother theme is one that I didn't really realize I was exploring till the end of the book.
Right.
And then I was like, oh, hang on. There are four mother-daughter relationships out of
Yeah.
the main characters, and many more
Hmm.
kind of sort of less sort of subsidiary character figures are
Yes.
also mother-daughter relationships.
Mm.
And then I kind of realized that it just made sense.
Mhm.
It just made sense that if you're going to have an intergenerational book, which was the plan, that and I wrote it in such a way that I would write one character and then their mother would come into it, or I would write a mother and their child would come into it. So I started writing Amma. Yaz was not part of the plan. And then at some point, writing Amma's story, I'm like, oh, I know she's going to have a kid. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. And she's going to have a kid with Roland, even
Right.
better. you
Yeah.
know. And so Yaz came into it, and then Carol's section, it was like her mother came into it. And as a writer, I am actually very big on family as a writer, and it's something that critics and people who write about my work don't pick up on,
Mm.
because they're always thinking it's about race, it's about gender, it's about
Yes.
sexuality, it's about class. I'm like, yeah, and it's about family, and
Yes.
it's about relationships. You could write a book about Go Home Another, all about family, and
Yes.
you could write another book all about other kinds of relationships and friendships. Seriously,
Hmm.
let alone a little essay,
Hmm.
because that is, we don't exist in isolation. We exist in a network of relationships, and especially when we're younger, our primary relationships are with our families. And so that's how it materialized.
Mm.
It was just a very organic process. And then what I like is that they're different kinds of relationships as well. You
Yes.
know, maybe there are some kind of recurrent themes, but they're different. You know, Yaz and Amma are different to
Bummy.
Carol and Bummy,
Bummy. Yeah.
and Shirley and Winsome again have a different
Mm.
kind of relationship.
Mm, yeah, amazing. And I was actually, it occurred to me, I'm like, okay, I don't want to ask all the questions about women because there are male characters in your book. And as you say, although the audience may not be populated with many men, some men do engage. And so I just wanted to I'm intrigued about the husbands and fathers and the way that they're presented as well. Often, literature written by Black authors presenting the kind of Black family relationship often present Trey and Jordan's type of characters and that kind of stereotypical experience there. But in your text, you've kind of explored such an expanse, like you say, that plurality, that diversity. And I really wanted you to speak to some of the male characters that you included in the text. Um, and kind of what inspired the direction that you took to convey that sense of plurality. And even then, some of the characters are really complex in that they're really good husbands, but they may also be adulterous, etc. So I just kind of wanted you to speak to those choices you made there.
You know, I kind of feel that often I don't need what we call a sensitivity reader, because I'm really sensitive to the issues myself. I kind of, yeah,
Yeah.
because I'm so aware as I'm writing, and it's not even that I'm overthinking it, it's just there. I'm aware that if I'm going to have all these characters, I just don't want anyone to feel that I've written stereotypes.
Mm.
And so, but at the same time, there are certain realities that stereotypes might sometimes be based on. So I just wanted that span.
Yeah.
And Roland gave me a lot of pleasure. And in the original draft, Roland had his own section, because I found Roland very, very funny and
Yeah.
entertaining. And then eventually my editor said, look, Roland kind of throws it out a bit, because it is about 11 women, one non-binary character. You know, you've now got Roland. It kind of changes the dynamic somehow. And so my heart bled, and I had to reduce Roland's contribution as much
Wow.
as entertaining as I found him. So he is a gay man, a successful academic, but he's quite narcissistic, um, and yeah, very, very opinionated, and a great sort of counterpoint to Amma, and also great material for Yaz,
Hmm.
who, as a teenager, sees faults with both her parents. I love writing that, because we know that, you know, teenagers often get to a stage where they're really critical of their parents. And there's a lot to be critical of from Yaz's point of view. And she hasn't yet reached the stage where she might be more compassionate and understanding, and really understand where her parents are coming from. So he is a successful public figure. And that was important. And also, I knew it'd be unexpected, because there aren't that many Rolands out there in this country, to be
Hmm.
honest, not who are as well known as he is, you know, on television a lot and so on. Uh, Lennox is kind of like just your regular guy, you know, but also has his backstory. He's succeeded, he's struggled,
Yeah.
he's this solid figure. And I did worry a bit about making him an adulterer. But I was like, it's such a good story. You know, you got to complicate everybody, right?
Yeah.
Everybody has to, every single protagonist, and there are 12 of them, have to be complicated. And in a way, you feel you know Roland. You may even recognize Roland. But then what he does is something that completely throws everything out of whack. It's like, what? And yet it's also something that stays secret ever.
Yeah.
It's between him and the mother. So, I feel that this book, there are so many touch points in this book that might cause people to reflect on people they know, situations they know, plus themselves. So the kind of secret affair, let alone between your mother-in-law, was very kind of juicy to write.
Yeah.
And then Augustine, Carol's father, who is a minor figure, but a very positive figure. Some people have said to me, well, I think you're a bit critical of the guys. And I'm like, that wasn't my intention. And I think if I'm critical with the guys, I feel I'm critical with everybody, because you see everybody through kind of 360 degrees. You see them through how they see themselves, how other characters see them, and so on. And then it's up to you if you want to judge the characters.
Yeah.
But Augustine doesn't really put a foot wrong, except he dies. So then he becomes an absence, yeah.
And it's interesting actually you make your point about Augustine, because I think that despite him dying, Bummy definitely uses him as like a source of a lot of her decisions and like perspectives and the way that she even communicates with Carol. So I feel like he still in some way lives on through her in that way, and obviously that I think is evidence therefore of him being a loving father and husband too.
That's right. And then there's Joseph. I'm just remembering.
Yeah.
It is Joseph, isn't it? It's been a few years.
Yeah.
Grace's father,
Yeah.
who was also a good man, but he's a man of his time. He is. He's a man of his time. And this is like 100 years before Oprah, right? Or not 100 years, but all the conversations that we've had about how about women and sexual relationship within marriage, all the rest of it, that we have to remember we're talking about a relationship that was 120 years ago. So people may think that he's a brute, but is he within the context of the society he's growing up in?
Yeah.
It's not for me to judge. No. Other people do, but I write what I think is the truth of the situation.
That time, that context. Amazing. I can't believe the time has literally flown. It's upon us completely. And I just want to say thank you so much to the delegates for sending in questions. I'm going to get to the delegates' questions first, and then if we have time, I'll go to the final ones. But a teacher's asked you to speak about Shirley, the character who is Shirley, the character who's the teacher in the book. So they just wanted to know a little bit more about
Shirley. I like Shirley. I like all my characters.
Yeah.
I love them all. They're all my children. But Shirley, I had a lot of fun writing Shirley because she's somebody who's also successful. She's a school teacher. My mother was a school teacher. And my mother retired a long time ago now. She's 89. She retired 30-something years ago. But I did some research into what it was like for her teaching in the 1980s, because she left at the end of, my maths isn't good, but anyway, she stopped teaching at the end of the 1980s or early 90s. And I know because she had talked about it, it became very difficult. So I used that research, how the education system changed during her time of teaching, and it became much more impositional and difficult, and schools became more difficult in all kinds of ways, social issues and so on. And then I put that into Shirley's story about somebody who goes into teaching as as somebody who is committed to furthering, bringing on the next generation of children who are growing up in a, what would have been called a deprived area, passing on her knowledge, she feels love, such beneficence and love for the children, and how she gets worn down over 40 years, but also doesn't really help herself. So she's kind of, because she could have moved to a different school, and we know why, because she can't take that risk. She's somebody who's really unable to change her life.
Yeah,
She finds herself stuck. Shirley is stuck. And for a character like Shirley, I've been around. I'm Shirley's age, I've known people like that, who have become stuck in whatever it is they're doing, and then also can't appreciate what they have. So another reason Shirley was interesting is because, as her mother says, you got a nice car, you got a big house, you paid off your mortgage, you got a cushy job, you have really long holidays, you got a hunky husband, you got two lovely grandchildren, all these external markers of a successful, happy life. And Shirley isn't happy. And her mother can't understand that. And the deeper psychology, you can also look at that in terms of her relationship with Lennox, Winsome's relationship with Lennox. What is going on? What is the deeper psychology going on there? Why does Winsome go for Lennox, really? Because she sees her daughter having all these things that she doesn't have. And at the end of her life, later in her life, when she retires to Barbados, she has a lovely life. She has spent something like 40 years struggling, right? And her daughter has, in her opinion, everything and can't appreciate it. And has very real concerns about what it's like teaching now and what it's like teaching in her school. Obviously, it's the criminal element and the violence and so on and so forth. And they're very, very real. But she doesn't change her situation. I feel like I'm talking to the teachers here now.
Yeah, no, literally.
There might be some people thinking, that's it. I'm going to resign. I'm going to get a job.
Relocate to Barbados. But anyway, how do you feel about being studied in the classroom and students writing exam essays on your work?
I love it, actually, because it means, it means my work is being taken seriously. What makes me laugh is sometimes students and school pupils write to me and basically ask me the kind of questions that will mean that I'm writing their essay for them.
Right.
That is really funny. By the way, teachers, I feel your pain with ChatGPT and the AI and all the stuff that's going on now, because it's such an issue. But no, I feel that it's a recognition that my work is being taken seriously. So when Girl, Woman, Other went onto the curriculum, I was absolutely delighted, because I've always wanted that. And really, it kind of took the booker for that to happen. But now it's happened. I think it's great. And I love the fact that young people are reading and engaging with my work.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that point, if students are to select your novel as a text for their coursework, what text do you think they can study alongside it to kind of illuminate the themes and the ideas that you spoke about in Go, Woman, Other?
Oh, so what other books you mean?
Yeah, so like one or two, maybe one canonical text and then one modern text that you can think of that they might be able to make an interesting.
I have big issues with The Lonely Londoners by Samuel Selvon, because it's seen as the defining work of the Windrush generation. Published like, how many years? 50, 70 years ago. But it is not quite 70, maybe 6 years ago, but it is about young men, and the women are invisible in it. And when they're talked about, it's in a derogatory way. And so I think it's a very problematic text. I'm not saying it shouldn't be taught, but I think it should be taught in context. So from that to Go, Woman, Other, a comparative analysis of that would be really, really interesting. And a more contemporary book, I'm really pleased to say, for anybody who's looking for books by Black British women novelists to teach or to refer to or to read, I wrote an essay for Vogue a few months ago, British Vogue, and it's still online. You can access it. And I mentioned 60 books that are being published this year. including books by Diana Evans, for example, who has now written several novels. So I think there's a lot of material to draw on. But if it's and so let's talk about a non-fiction book, then I think, you know, British by Afua Hirsch, I think is a good text to read to give people a bit of a context. Any David Olusoga, Black and British, you know, the history of Black Britain. I mean, there were many predecessors to that book, but that's really, you know, it's a current one and it's really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the character of Carol, what in terms of what you said about being a professional in a white majority country, how did you research and write Carol's character? So one of the teachers have asked, how did you research and write Carol's character?
So some of the characters were easier to write than others. Carol was very easy. She was very easy. She just came to me. And as I kind of say, like I've said it a few times, I've lived a long time and I've been around a lot of Black women, right? And families and the rest of it. So, and I grew up in one as well. I had a white mum, so that was different. But I kind of, it's there. Everything I've ever experienced, seen, read, witnessed, known went into the making of Carol. The research I needed to do was into her job because I don't understand finance, and it was a pain trying to explain her job without keeping the story lively.
Yes.
So that was the research. So yeah, so it was like if you're around people, sometimes you don't need to research because you know it.
Yeah.
You know what needs to be written.
That reminds me, actually, I wanted to ask, was Bummy also a mathematician? Were you trying to?
She did. I think she did economics.
Yeah, because the way you presented her was that she was just as good at maths as.
No, I think she did maths.
I was gonna say, yeah, okay, cool. Okay, good.
Because like I say, I'm very sensitive to stereotypes. So what would be the opposite to a stereotype for Bummy? It would be maths.
Yeah.
People are like, oh, maths, well, why not? You know?
Not? Absolutely. And do you believe if your role isn't to educate as a writer, one of the teachers wants to know, like, what is your role? What do you feel it is?
Yes.
Is it to entertain? What is it?
All of those things. So, you know, I think if you see yourself as an educator when you are writing fiction, you know, obviously, if you are writing a book about history, you are educating people. But if you see yourself as an educator when you're writing fiction, I think the fiction is going to suffer. It is going to be didactic. It is not coming from an open creative space, because the idea with fiction is that you create characters, stories, scenarios, and you make them as rich, as exciting, as interesting, as exploratory as you can, and then it lands where it lands. The reader needs to feel that they can connect to it in whatever way they do, as opposed to being told, this is the way you need to read this.
Yes.
And it feels like if you're coming from an educator viewpoint, educator creative approach, that you are then telling people how to read it.
Yeah.
And also the role of fiction isn't necessarily to educate. It is to entertain. It is a way in which we see ourselves reflected or not. It is a way in which we just explore the society around us, that we create drama and suspense and, you know, work with the imagination. All of those things are to do with writing fiction. And it's, you know, my point of view is you need to keep it as open as possible.
Absolutely. And let the reader take that agency and engage with it as they choose. Absolutely. Someone's asked about the additional text. So you spoke about Afua Hirsch's British, but in terms of these additional texts, this isn't in relation necessarily to understanding Girl, Woman, Other, but more in terms of critical thinking around diversity and race within the school. So I just wanted to know if there were any other texts that were related to that you could get insight
you know,
on.
I don't know if I'm the best person to ask this. I think Lit in Colour
Yeah,
will most definitely have a list of those books, and some of them will be published by Penguin, which will help
absolutely.
people think about the critical thinking. And, I guess Renée Edo-Lodge,
Yeah,
Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, it's a
yeah.
good place to have
To
a sort of
start.
101 into some of those intersectional issues.
Yeah, thanks for the plug. And before we kind of round up and like wrap up, I wanted to speak because I'm so fascinated by the fact that one of your stories was going to be Roland's experience. That is incredible to have heard that from you today. If you were to release a deluxe version of the novel, so some albums have like a deluxe version where they add a few songs with more characters. Is there a woman featured in the novel whose story you'd want to give space as you did these other characters?
Wow, that's amazing. You know something? The first character that comes to mind is Nzinga.
Yeah,
Let's hear what Nzinga's got to say, right?
yeah,
Because she gets a bit of a rough deal.
yeah,
That would be so interesting.
yeah,
That's a great question again.
yeah.
Nobody's asked me that. But yeah,
Me too.
Nzinga,
I'd love to
in
hear her.
her own words.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So a comment came in about from the audience kind of referencing how important it is for literature to push beyond cities and address experiences of people of color in rural areas, as you explored in the text and said earlier on. And the teacher just wanted to know, like, how did you find writing those parts of the book, in terms of setting the kind of the scene of those spaces, but then also trying to explain how being black in those spaces actually felt. So I guess we're thinking about like so
Yeah, so a lot of research, to be honest. I would say the northern part of the book, which is Hattie, Grace, and
yeah.
Morgan, was the hardest
Yeah.
in terms of describing place and
Mm,
just understanding the society and culture, especially as it was also historical and rural, right?
mm,
About which I know nothing. So, what was it like to be living and working on a farm 100 years ago, and then the changing life on a farm through the 20th century.
mm,
And then also, yeah, and also where Grace is growing up, which is, I think, South Shields.
mm.
So I had to do a lot of research. A lot of it is now available on the internet. Years ago, it
Yeah.
wasn't. So it makes it a lot easier. And then Clovis and Winsome going to Cornwall,
Yes.
and me writing that and looking at the map and trying to work out what their route would have been and what it would have been like for them there. So a lot of research. And then eventually you get enough for it to feel authentic, because you want people to feel like you know what you're talking about. And
Yeah.
in fact, not even to think that you know what you're talking about, but just to feel that they're in that
They're
place.
there.
Like, yeah, this is now I'm in this rural space, da da da. And I
Yeah.
was going to go and visit somewhere like Northumberland and go and visit a farm, but I just never got round to it. So I just had to do it through my imagination, which is really hard.
Yeah, but I think this point that you're making about the role that reading plays in writing is really powerful as well for teachers who might be supporting young people who want to become writers themselves, that actually reading, doing research, maybe not being able to access those spaces physically, but having insight in that way. Both fictional and non-fiction text can
I
also help
think,
them.
yeah, a couple of things. One is that I think it's really important that I don't know how people teach English literature today, but I
Mm,
think it's really important to allow the children to have their own contribution, whether you agree with it or not.
yes.
But they kind of need to defend it. And the
Mm,
second thing, in terms of if you're setting them creative writing exercises, is to, even though you're grading their work and so on, is to try and suspend judgment as much as possible, because that can kill creativity. And also to let them know that where they begin is not where they're going to end up,
yeah.
that people grow into their talent. So, you know, some of the children will have more of a natural facility with writing than others. That doesn't mean to say that those who don't have that, natural facility, which is probably coming about through their background anyway, like how much their parents are reading to them, whether they get encouragement at home and so on, that they cannot develop those skills as they grow through the system. Because
Mm.
I teach creative writing at university. I've been teaching creative writing for a long time. It's what I tell my students, because often they think if they can't do it now, they'll never be able to do it.
Yeah.
Creative writing,
Yeah.
because creative writing is something special. And they need to know that they can grow
Yes.
into their talent.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I honestly believe that is a perfect way to end this
Ta-da!
discussion. Thank you so much for your insightful comments and just being a great laugh. Actually, I've really enjoyed speaking to you today.
Thank you
And
for a lovely interview.
thank you. And thank you to all the delegates as well for sending in your questions and for your engagement. Um, just don't forget to take a picture of the QR code so you can access the book bundles. There's going to be a short 10-minute break after this. And then following the break, we will have Tanika Gupta being interviewed by Matthew Courtney. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.